right, welcome to another episode of our biblical story series, and we're going to be discussing again the topic which has raised a lot of discussion and questions regarding the Old Testament and slavery. So we're going to be doing 2 more episodes on that topic, and that's to follow up from our last 2 blogs and videos. In that regard, we're going to talk about the Old Testament laws, and were they laws that allowed Israelites to enslave foreigners, or were they laws that allowed for refugee protection? And I'm going to make what I think is a pretty strong and clear case that they allowed for refugee protection. So I'm going to turn it over to Brendan.
Yeah, I'll jump right into things. In the article, why do you claim that these foreigners were refugees? What's the evidence for that?
Well, I'm going to go through just a series of scriptures, for those who have not read the blog. As I began studying, this topic, it was so clear that the way God repeatedly commanded the Jews, the Israelites, to treat foreigners was as refugees who came under a special safeguards of rights, dignity, and protection. So I just want to go through 3 levels of evidence for that. First of all, foreigners were given equal rights of protection as were the Israelites. Leviticus 19, verses 33 to 34 reads as follows: "When a stranger resides with you in your land, a stranger, a foreigner, or a sojourner, you shall not do him wrong. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." So treat him well, give him the same love, give him the same rights, because you were once foreigners. This is very clear. Let's go to Deuteronomy 24, verses 17 through 18. "Do not deprive a foreigner or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of a widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. This is why I command you to do this. So do not deprive a foreigner of justice. Act toward them in a just manner, because you were slaves in Egypt." Again, Deuteronomy 10, verses 18 through 19. "He, being God, defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and he loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt." So the scriptures are clear. This is how you are to behave or to treat those who are foreigners from other nations. You are to love them, you are to feed them, you are to clothe them, you are to protect them, you are to do justly by them. Reason number 2 is that a foreigner they would become a debt servant, they could become an indentured servant, and we'll talk more about the details, especially at the next blog of what that looks, or the next series. But this could not, as they came in, they would work for somebody. They would be a debt servant, like we talked about 2 videos or 2 blogs ago, but they could not be forced. Anyone, Exodus 21, verse 16 says, "Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession." So this was not just, they didn't just kidnap to kidnap. You kidnap somebody because there's something you want. Kidnapping is not just done to kidnap. You kidnap because there is a reason, there's a leverage, there's some money you're going to gain, and this is in the context that if you do this and you sell them on the slave market, you will be killed. So it could not be forced. It had to be voluntary. So those who came in as refugees, they would give themselves over to work for Israelites, but it could not be forced. It had to be voluntary. Again, Deuteronomy 23, verses 15 through 16. If a servant has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you. If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like and whatever town they choose. Do not oppress them. So if a foreigner is leaving somebody, a slave, is leaving somebody who is oppressing them, you are to bring them in and let them live wherever they want to. They have the choice. And that was something that was given to a foreigner, according to some commentators, that wasn't even given to an Israelite. As an Israelite, you had to live in the area where your family, had land, or it had been, deeded to them, back in the days of Joshua. And so I could go on and on in terms of the rights and privileges and protections that were given. And so the context of all of these is that this foreigners came in voluntarily. They came in under situations of oppression or poverty that they were trying to escape, and they came in under a refugee status.
But why would the Bible then use the term slave?
A good question, and I think that's where this becomes very difficult. The Hebrew, I don't believe that the term there means slave, especially the way it is used today. The Hebrew term that is translated in modern Bibles is ebed. Okay. Ebed could mean, and often means, in fact, usually means a servant, a worker, an employee. In fact, Hebrew in its language, they didn't even have a term for slave. And I don't believe they had a term for slave because it's something that didn't exist. It wasn't an institution, so they didn't make a word. They knew the reality of it, but it wasn't practiced.
It wasn't a practice, yeah.
And so the word really means a servant, a worker, an employee, and it can mean a lot of different things. What is interesting as I did the study is that the earliest translation of the Bible that goes back to the 4th century is called the Latin Vulgate. It's where the Hebrew and Greek Bible was translated into Latin into the Roman world. And whenever those translators of the Latin Vulgate, they saw the term abed, they would use the Latin term servus, meaning servant, or sometimes they would use the term familius, meaning family. They never used the term mancipus, which means a slave as property. Okay. Now you go to 1611, the King James Version. The King James Version never uses the term slave. It uses the term servant. Sometimes it uses the term bondman, but mainly servant. And even as the King James Version was updated, in the 19th century, they still use the same terminology. It wasn't until 1952 with the Revised Standard Version that the word slave was used with in 1952, and it was after that that it became commonly translated as slave. But many scholars and many biblical experts do not believe that slave is really an accurate translation, especially with the ideas that the term slavery has, in the modern day thinking. And I can understand, I could go into why I think they did use the term slave, but it really doesn't mean what we think it does today.
Can you just briefly go into why you think they use the term slave? Like, why would they? What would be the purpose
I think because what is taking place is that they become servants. They're debt servants. There's an economic relationship that's taking place. They're impoverished. The only reason they have these laws is because they're in an impoverished situation.
Okay.
So it's a means of getting out of it. And so I think the term servant or employee or worker doesn't quite get at the economic relationship of what would be called debt servanthood or indentured servanthood. Yet that's not a term we commonly use. So I think back in 1952 they would use the term slave, but it didn't have all the connotations. I think people were more flexible in how they understood the meaning of it, that it wasn't like a chattel slavery or something from the antebellum South or something to that effect. And that's speculation on my part, but that's why I reason that it became more common to translate it that way.
So it may have been done out of a desire to have a word that was stronger than just like employee or servant, but slaves probably a little too strong.
Way too strong.
Yeah.
So we're just having a problem with just translating the meaning of what it was back then to what we understand and terminology we have today. It's a translation problem. But abed can mean slave, but it usually doesn't. And you have to interpret that word by the way it is used in the passage. And we have to be very clear about that.
That's the way language works.
Exactly. And this is an issue of translation. I think it clarifies a lot for us.
Okay. So how does this all fit into the larger story of God and for the nation, God for the nations in Genesis 12?
Right. When you look at these laws of God bringing in the foreigners as refugees, it goes back to Genesis 12 when God said to Abraham and called him, and he said that through your offspring I will bless, and they will be a blessing to the nations. And that has been the story of God all along, is that he would take Israel as one nation, and through that nation he would start to restore his life, reveal who he is and his promises, and the blessings of Israel would then be given to the other nations, and that's why we're here today as the church. But that started in kind of a seed or a chrysalis form, if you will, by God saying, I am so generous that those foreigners who come in, that you are to love them, you are to treat them, you are to understand that the blessings that I'm giving to you are to go through to all of the nations. And so because of that, the foreigners could participate in the covenant. They could participate in the worship. They could participate in the rites. They could participate, and they could become proselytes or converts to the Jewish faith. The Old Testament is very clear on that. And so it's a sneak preview, if you will, of how the Jewish covenant and God's promises are going to then unfold to the nations in which they've done today. So far from enslaving and oppressing, the very spirit of what God is wanting to do is to bless the nations. And it's an amazing story.
It is. So then what does, kind of fast forwarding a little bit, what does this tell us about our treatment of refugees from other nations today?
Yeah. I think, as I've studied this passage, it's challenged me, with our own nation. And there's nothing within our Constitution that says that we have to bring in refugees. That's an issue that is left up to the legislatures of the federal government and state governments. But I think our disposition should be very favorable towards refugees, towards those who are hurting in other nations, and that as we bless other nations by bringing in oppressed and persecuted people, that is what our nation has been established for in part. And the spirit of it is to be a light to all nations. And as we bring people in for protection, as we bring people in, for safety, as we bring people in for opportunities, then we are becoming more of what our country was meant to be in terms of a force or a light for good to other nations. Now, it's a complicated issue, but I think our disposition should be very positive. Refugees is a different issue from people just immigrating to the country. That's a whole nother question. And immigration is important in terms of policy, but I think our laws that allow asylum for refugees has its root I think in the heart of Christianity, but also very much in the spirit of the laws given to the nation of Israel.
And you mentioned that it was interestingly enough, an Old Testament scholar, a Jew who wrote the inscription on the Statue of Liberty?
Yes, the great Colossus, give us your poor, give us your, that's on Emma Lazarus. And she wasn't a Jewish scholar, but she was Jewish.
Okay.
And she was steeped within the Jewish tradition. She grew up in a Jewish family. And you look at all of her poetry, much of it is just steeped in Old Testament, Old Testament language and meaning, because and this greatly informs her understanding of how we treat, immigrants, refugees, and those types of things. And so, in her poem, The Great Colossus, she had written that so beautifully. So, And just here's one section of it. This is on the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuge of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. And so beautifully stated. And she was steeped in Jewish scriptures. And if she read, as she did, the Old Testament, this reflects the very spirit of the law that God gave to the Israelites.
All right. Thank you very much, Anthony.
Welcome.
Thank you for joining Anthony and I today on the Biblical Story video series. Please subscribe to the Crossroads CCO YouTube channel, like, and share this video. Until next time.